Hi, good day everyone. My name's Alex, and I'd like to welcome you all to this Ubiquiti switch range overview. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I am Leader's National Trainer, and I'm first and foremost a massive Ubiquiti fanboy. Along with me today, I've got Chris Sutherland as well, who is the Product Manager for Ubiquiti within Leader. We're really excited to be talking to you guys about Ubiquiti and specifically Ubiquiti switches, as I know this is a pretty hot topic for many of you at the moment. This is a quick session. It only runs for about 30 minutes. At the end of it, we are going to do a prize draw as well, so do stick around for that. And there will be questions, Q&A session afterwards as well. Questions are most welcome. You guys are most welcome to push them through at any point in time, any questions you have. We will try to answer those questions during the course of the training. Alternatively, at the end of it, we will answer them as well. We'll review all the questions raised. So this webinar will also be recorded and it will be shared out to everyone automatically after. And those that didn't attend as well will also receive a recording of this. So with that being said, let's quickly take a look at the Ubiquiti switches and how we would position the enterprise switches specifically. So to get started, today's big focus is obviously more on the switching side of things. A very big part of the switches is obviously the ability to manage them. I think most of you would be fairly familiar with the different Ubiquiti applications. The switches are managed through the network application mainly. That tends to be the main selling point of Ubiquiti devices as well. A lot of the competitors tend to have or rely on the built-in GUI of the device, whereas Ubiquiti, you have this nice central management interface. As I said, it's managed through the network application. That network application can be run either on a PC via software that you install, or it can be run through something like the UDM or Cloud Key or something like that. This network application obviously provides you with a lot of insight. It provides you with excellent control of your devices. It has a nice and user-friendly GUI as well. And it is the primary control method for actually managing your switches. So with that being said, we'll take a step further and look at the actual switching side of it. So this is more on the software. And we're going to start off with just a very quick overview of what the different switch ranges are. So the ones that we're going to be focused on today is the enterprise switches, but Ubiquiti provides a broad range of switches depending on the application and the use case. So enterprise is our focus for today, but we obviously do provide the Pro, Standard, Light, and Flex devices as well. It really depends on the use case. Ubiquiti try to fill market gaps through the various product ranges, and each one of them pretty much has their own specific niche. Taking a look at the Flex series of devices, for example, they're quite powerful, small form factor little devices. They're typically designed for specific applications and use cases. The Light series of switches is pretty much the starting point for Ubiquiti switches. Still fully managed, very cost effective. It lacks some of the more advanced features that you would typically see, but it's really designed as a starting point or as a edge switch, so something that you would deploy just to fill a specific area. And they only go up to about 16 ports, so really as a starting point for the Ubiquiti device range. Then the Standard and Pro series, I tend to refer to these as the bread and butter switches. I think many of you would be selling these switches predominantly now as your main switching brand and your main switch category, so Pro and Standard devices. They obviously do offer a lot more advanced functionality as well. So stuff like PoE, PoE++, and PoE+ on some switches. They do support a broad range of applications, as we can see in the advanced features section as well. And critically, I think one of the things that we are trying to differentiate as part of the reason to go for enterprise is the fact that the Pro and Standard switches do not support 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet. They are purely 1 gigabit per second Ethernet devices. They do obviously support SSP modules as well, so you can add SSP modules and potentially have fiber or faster Ethernet connectivity, but really the focus today is on the enterprise side of things. Enterprise, to me, I'm hopeful that at the end of this webinar, this will be everyone's new bread and butter. All of the features of the standard and pro switches are built into the enterprise devices, plus the ability to support 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet, and even up to 25 gigabit per second via the SFP modules. So let's take a look at each one of these switches in more detail. So this is just a quick glance. We'll provide a bit of an overview in more depth in the next slides. So we'll start off with the light switches. So the light switches, like I said before, only 8 and 16 port variants. They do support PoE and PoE Plus. It's really pretty much all the basics. It's really designed for small businesses, and it's again, like I said before, it's the starting point. We see this deployed a lot in companies that are brand new, that are just looking for basic connectivity between computers, etc. That's typically where that's used for. Alternatively, as a very cost-effective device for just a edge deployment, it's also really good at that. In terms of the flex range, like I said, they are typically designed for a specific use case, and we'll see that in the various models as well. So the Flex Mini is designed to go on a desk. It's extremely compact. It's a really nice small form factor. It looks very good as well. And its niche or its trump card is that it's powered by a 5-volt USB-C charger. So that is the same charger that you can use off your mobile phone. You can actually use that to power this device. And it's really designed to sit on your desk. Small form factor, it's not too obtrusive by sitting on your desk. A really good looking device. And then the USW Flex, it's designed for outdoor use. Also, again, a very unique use case where you would actually deploy your switch outdoors. And it can actually be powered by PoE or PoE++, PoE Plus or PoE++. And importantly, it can even pass through that PoE as well. So if you're intending to power up other devices from that Flex, the USW Flex, you absolutely can do that. Because it's outdoor rated, it is weatherproof, so you can actually use it in outdoor environments. And then the next step up from that is the Flex XG, which is at the top of the Flex range. Essentially, it provides you with 4 10 gigabit per second Ethernet ports, and it is designed to be a cost-effective and entry-level switch for the 10 gigabit per second networking space. I think you'll struggle to find any other switches that are 10 gigabit per second capable at this price point. Really cost-effective device that actually provides 10 gigabit per second Ethernet. 10 gigabit per second Ethernet tends to be very expensive still. By having a switch at this price point, it really gives Ubiquiti a nice advantage. And then another device that's there is the USW Industrial. As the name would suggest, it's for industrial use. It is fanless, it is ruggedized. It's quite a heavy beast. It's designed specifically to go into areas where a traditional switch wouldn't cope. If you think about roofs and places like that, that's really where it's designed to go. It is dust resistant as well, so a really good device to put into those locations, and it does actually output PoE++ as well. So that's really the starting point. Going on from there, just again, a little bit of a talk around the Flex devices. So this is one of the light devices on the desk. You can see how compact it is, small form factor, CoCan next to it there. Really good looking. The biggest benefit to this, obviously, is that it's still a very powerful and very capable device. And its design is very elegant. Going on from there, the next tier up from that is the Ubiquiti high performance switches, as they call it. Most of these switches come in either a PoE or non-PoE variant. You'll generally find that the PoE devices are more expensive, as they would be. They physically have more circuitry and bigger power supplies to provide PoE capabilities. So these are designed to be your run-of-the-mill normal switches that are meant to go into data cabinets, etc. And the biggest selling point, obviously, is that it's still managed through that Ubiquiti network interface. You do get the different variants depending on your requirements, and you also get different variants that output different PoE levels. So your max PoE budget changes per switch. We'll talk about the PoE budgets in a fair bit of detail in the next couple of slides as it becomes very important. As mentioned before, you can also connect your SFP modules to this as well, and SFP provides you with more flexibility. You can either use fiber or you can do faster Ethernet through that SFP port if you wish. And going on from there, so this is what I think the most of you would have experienced or used before. I think most of you have seen these switches or interacted with them in some way. The intention of this webinar is to really show you why you should be going for the enterprise switches as opposed to these switches. These switches are still perfectly fine, but really the focus of today is to speak to the abilities of the enterprise devices. Very important to take away from this slide, I'm not going to delve into all of the details, but very important to take away is that you'll see that the ports, so all of these switches have 1 gigabit per second Ethernet ports. And then another key takeaway from this as well is that even though they are PoE, not all of the switch ports are PoE capable. So for example, the USW24 PoE, that's 24 ports total, but 16 ports are PoE. So that is an important note to make. When we're looking at the enterprise switches, we'll understand why that becomes important as well. We'll talk about PoE budget and switching capacity in a lot more detail in a moment as well. So another key thing to note is that only the Pro models, so you'll see the ones listed with Pro in the name, support the DC connectivity, so that is redundant power supply connectivity, which allows you to back up that switch in case of a power outage. Again, more info on that later, but we'll see it as we get to it. And then going up from there, these are essentially the same range of series, but just with larger port variants. Similarly, the PoE models do not always support PoE across all the ports, and again, it's limited to 1 gigabit per second across the Ethernet interfaces. The SSPs, again, you have more flexibility, but really these are designed to be standard 1 gigabit per second Ethernet switches. And then another key product that's listed on here is the USW Mission Critical. It functions kind of as a switch, and most importantly, it also has a built-in battery. So it can actually be used to power up Ubiquiti devices in case of a power failure. You can also even connect up external batteries to that as well. It's ideal for mission-critical environments or mission-critical kit. So for example, if you think about VoIP phones or access control, both of which use PoE today, it is very important to make sure that those devices still function in the case of a power outage. Businesses can't survive without their phones being up, so that USW Mission Critical really is for mission critical use cases. And then going on from there to what we're specifically focusing on today, it's the enterprise range of switches. So why are we focusing on enterprise so specifically? Firstly, let's quickly talk about stock. So we have a fair amount of these devices on hand, and we've got more coming, and we're trying to constantly get more of these devices in as well. So we still have these devices available, whereas I know there has been a lot of shortages experienced in some of the other switch ranges. So we're talking about why we would sell these devices to your customers instead, and it is actually pretty important that we have this discussion with your customers now, as it impacts their how they would essentially set up their network in the future. So it is really important that we have this discussion. So we've seen more of these switches come out of Ubiquiti as well. Ubiquiti is trying to use the chips that they get through the chip shortage on the bigger devices, purely because it's nicer to have, or it's better to have a enterprise level device that can handle a lot more functionality rather than restricting the functionality and only having small switches. The enterprise switches do come in 8-port, 24-port, and 16-port variants. 48-port variants, not 16 ports. Those are the most popular sizes. And then the biggest change that you'll notice there is that the enterprise switches come with 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet. Extremely, extremely important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. They do also support 10 gigabit per second uplinks, and the 24-port version, the XG version, actually even supports 25 gigabit per second uplink. That is really critical for larger deployments where you have large data throughputs, it really becomes important to have that switch be able to output that data from the switch itself. So taking a look at the other advantages, or the next step up from that, something that is often overlooked is the fiber aggregation switches. Ubiquiti also does a complete range of aggregation switches. We typically refer to these as the top of rack switches. They would normally go onto the top of the rack, into the top of the rack. And it provides you with a lot more port flexibility through the SFP. So you'll see the number of SFP ports on these devices is considerable, and you can use SFP modules to your heart's extent. And it's designed, again, to provide a central point for all of your switches to aggregate through. And as a result of that, you'll also see the switching capacity, especially on the Aggregation Pro, as a massive increase. So it has 760 gigabit per second switching capacity, which is considerable. This is ideal for larger businesses where you need to aggregate all of your data before it goes out or goes to another branch or goes across the internet. So let's take a more in-depth look at a comparison. So we're going to do 3 comparisons, and we're essentially going to look at the different types of models compared. So we're going to do the light switches, we're going to do the standard switches, and we'll compare the pro switches as well to the enterprise variants. So in our first example, we have the USW Enterprise 8 PoE. This model actually has a bigger PoE budget. You'll see the PoE budget that's listed, there's 120 watts as opposed to only 52 watts on the USW Lite. It provides support for 10 gigabit per second uplink, again through SFP. And then also important, it has AR management capabilities. We'll talk about AR management in a moment, but it's essentially that little screen on the front of it. And that allows you to both get a lot more info on that switch as it's in the rack, and then use it with the AR devices. You've heard me talk about PoE, PoE Plus, and PoE Plus Plus a bit, but just for the guys that are uninitiated, we'll quickly talk about what the difference is. The main difference is the amperage. It's the amount of amps carried across the Ethernet cable. So essentially PoE Plus and PoE Plus Plus are capable of providing more power to devices, and they're actually capable of powering up more powerful devices. If you think, for example, about a speed dome camera or something similar, it has motors on the inside of it. It needs a fair amount of power to actually drive that device. And as a result of that, the power requirement is a lot more. And for that, you'll typically use something like PoE Plus or PoE Plus Plus. So the total power budget that we're talking about in this, and the reason why it's important, is the total number of watts that the switch can output. So that is the combined total for the entire switch. Depending on the device that you're powering with it, it can consume a lot of that power budget in a single port even. So if we take a look at normal PoE, the max power output per port is 12 watts. PoE Plus 30 watts, and PoE Plus Plus is actually 60 watt per port. So if you take a look at that USW Lite, it means that can potentially output all of its maximum power budget to a single device, which would leave you in a bit of a pickle if you have multiple devices that you need to power via PoE. And for that reason, it is always important to have a bigger power budget. Again, you get that through the enterprise devices. They physically have bigger power supplies built into them, and they're more capable of outputting that PoE budget. And then taking it up to the 24 port switches. So the USW24, it's extremely popular switch. We sell lots of them. Why would we go for the enterprise variant of them instead? Again, the PoE budget is a massive improvement, and we'll actually talk about that the PoE budget quickly. So if you were to take, for example, the USW24, it only has 16 ports with PoE. And if you were to have that switch fully populated, the max it could actually output is only about 6 watts per port. That's enough for powering up a VoIP phone, but as soon as you're connecting anything more powerful like an access point to it, it's effectively restricting the number of devices you can connect. The USW enterprise, so the 24-port enterprise variant of it. Again, if it's fully populated, you can actually get up to 16 watts per port if fully populated. On the USW24, you potentially could power up to about 7 access points. On the USW Enterprise 24, you could actually power up all 24 ports. You could actually power up all 24 access points from those ports. So a really big difference between them. And again, it's one of the reasons there is a price difference between the two of them. Physically more circuitry, physically a bit bigger power supply in them as well. Again, another big advantage is the 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet capabilities. It's critical for networking today. And then, of course, the 10 gigabit per second Ethernet uplink as well. You need to get that data out of the switch. And then taking a look at the 48-port variants. So when we're comparing the Pro devices to the Enterprise devices, the gap narrows a bit. There isn't so much of a difference, but also the price difference between them narrows considerably. It becomes a much closer race, but you still get a bigger power budget. You still get 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet, and you do have that switching capacity increase as well. Okay, so we've talked about the PoE budget, and we've talked about the 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet. Why do we really need 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet? I think the world's pretty much settled on doing networking in tens. So when we've originally looked at the Ethernet standards, we went from 1 gigabit per second to 10 gigabit per second. But it's important to understand where 2.5 gigabit per second fits in. So when we develop the next generation from 1 to 10 gigabit per second, we don't actually have very many devices that use 10 gigabit per second at this moment. And 10 gigabit per second devices are still fairly expensive. So where do we need 2.5 gigabits for? Well, the reason is one of them is Wi-Fi 6. So Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7, we're actually right at the limit of 1 gigabit per second already. So potentially a Wi-Fi 6 access point can do 1 to 1.2 gigabit per second. So you're actually getting limited by the port speed on the access points and the switch. And I think the biggest advantage is if you look at the next generation, Wi-Fi 7, we are actually expecting to see multi-gigabit per second. So that means real world throughput, your TCP throughput will increase dramatically. And it means essentially you're going to be bottlenecked by a 1 gigabit per second Ethernet port. 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet is essentially the answer to that. Why? Because even Wi-Fi 7 won't exceed 10 gigabit per second most likely. 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet is still 1 times faster than your standard current gigabit per second Ethernet. So it's a massive improvement. And essentially, one of the key selling points to the enterprise switches is that we will have the ability to go to Wi-Fi 7 and go to the next generation of internet and have increased throughput levels on our Ethernet ports. Okay. And then another important thing to note is we think Wi-Fi 7 is years off. It's not. It's next year. The Wi-Fi generations are increasing very quickly, and for that reason, we need to prepare our customers for it now. So that's one of the key selling points to it. Is I would tell my customers, if you're looking to have better Wi-Fi in future, you need to do 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet, and the way you do that is through the Ethernet, through the enterprise switches. And then that's all fine for internal networks, but what about internet connectivity? Well, that's around the corner or here as well. Multi-gigabit per second internet connectivity is already available to businesses. We need to think about how we are going to push that into our business network. And again, the answer to that is 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet. Let's do a quick stock take of where we're at. Why would we use 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet and enterprise switches if we can get 10 gigabit per second Ethernet already? It exists. Why wouldn't we use that instead? Well, the main reason for that is price and difficulty. So we'll talk about price first. 10 gigabit per second Ethernet adapters, just a comparison of Ethernet adapters, are more than double the price currently, and that is taken off a Amazon snapshot from yesterday, it is still a very big price difference. And just on the network cards, that makes a huge difference. If you think about 20 PCs, if you were to outfit them with network interface cards that can handle 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet, 20 PCs, your price would increase from $1,200 for 20 to $2,500 plus to just do 10 gigabit per second Ethernet. And remember that we don't have very many devices that can actually benefit from 10 gigabit per second Ethernet, where we do have a lot of devices that can already benefit from 2.5 gigabit per second. And then I've got a little bit of an unfair comparison here. I'm comparing the outdoor Cat5e cable to indoor Cat6a cable, and you can again see the cable price difference is massive. It's 35% more to go for Cat6a. And that brings me on to another point. One of the biggest advantages to 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet is that we can reuse our existing cables. If you've already deployed Ethernet through a building, think about hotels and places like that, for example, it would be a real pain to pull up that cabling. Whereas 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet, you can actually reuse the existing cable. It's a lot more expensive to go for Cat6, specifically in terms of both the cable cost and in terms of the amount of work that you have to do around that as well. You have to redo the whole building essentially. And that brings us onto the labor side. You can think of what the cost would be if you were to actually redo an entire building's cabling, and you typically see these ad hoc networks getting created where people just run the cables through wherever they can. So 2.5 gigabit per second provides them with the ability to future-proof their environment and make sure that their future environments are actually up to spec. And then, like I said before, there's some more advantages to the enterprise switches. They do support the ability to do power redundancy as well. So everything but the 8-port variant supports power redundancy through the uplink Ubiquiti RPS equipment. And essentially, it's designed to provide you power through power outages and the ability to still power your switches, etc., from the RPS device. It's critical for VoIP, and it makes sure that your business survives when there's a power outage. One of the other advantages is that all of the enterprise switches are layer 3 capable. And as an advantage to this, one of the things it can do is actually inter-VLAN routing. Let's do a quick example of where we would use inter-VLAN routing. I'm borrowing some slides from the Ubiquiti training for this. Essentially, if we were to have data coming from my trainer laptop and needing to reach a student laptop, the data path that it would have to follow in a traditional network is it would have to go across the access point to the switch. The switch would look for that device on the local network. It wouldn't be able to find it because it's looking at MAC addresses. It would then have to reach through to our router. Our router will go, okay, cool. We understand what VLANs are. We understand what IP addresses are. It will recognize that the device is on another subdomain, and then it will essentially allow the device to communicate to the other device in the different subdomain. By having a layer 3 switch, essentially what we can do is the switch can handle all the routing tables. It understands that there are devices in different subdomains, and it can actually directly handle that traffic to point it to the correct device. It's actually a big advantage in terms of latency. Data doesn't have to go across multiple hops to reach a router somewhere. It can do all of that traffic handling on the switch itself. So both in terms of speed and in terms of your latency, it provides you with a massive advantage. Another part of the enterprise switches as well is that it can actually do broadcast traffic isolation. Broadcast traffic typically makes up a large portion of network traffic, and specifically on wireless networks, it is very important to restrict that as much as possible. Without going into too much depth about it, essentially it provides you with the ability to restrict that broadcast traffic so that it doesn't interfere with the rest of your network unnecessarily. And then one of the other key features of the enterprise switches as well is that it does support static routing. It is essentially used for a whole bunch of advantages. It has its drawbacks as well, but static routing can provide you with improved security. It uses less processing power on the switch, which is especially important if you're using something like deep packet inspection or something like that. and in general, it provides more throughput. You require less bandwidth. There's a whole bunch of advantages to this as well. So IT admins tend to love static routing, and the enterprise switches provide you with that ability as well. And then, like I mentioned before, AR, so AR's augmented reality networking insights. What you can do with the enterprise devices, you can actually use your mobile device to see which ports are used by which devices, which is really, really powerful. And then another key takeaway is that, and I think this is something that people often overlook, is you can actually use the design center to do your switch placement as well. So if you're going to a customer and you need to do a network diagram, the design center from Ubiquiti is actually a very handy tool for that. I would highly recommend it, and it provides you something to go to the customer with. You can provide them with info on what they are actually going to be getting from you. I think it sets you apart from your competitors as well. So with that being said, we're pretty much at the end of this. I just quickly want to make a mention. So we do have the Ubiquiti Leader, the Leader Academy site available as well, and that has a lot of the Ubiquiti content on. So if you found anything in this which you find interesting and you want to learn more, please do feel free to have a look at our Leader Academy site. We have tons of training coming up throughout the entire country. Highly recommend that you guys take a look at it. We also do have a full list of all the webinars which are coming up for the rest of the year. Again, highly recommend that you register for that and have a look at what is coming up. With that being said, that is the Leader Academy link. So if you guys want to navigate to that site, you're more than welcome. Again, because this is shared afterwards, you can grab it from there as well if you want to. And we're now going to go into the prize draw. So we're actually giving away some switches for this. And we're actually going to do 2 switches this time. So I've just received a list of all the names of all the attendees. So if you give me 2 seconds, I'll quickly pull it up and we'll do the prize draw.
Thank you, Alex. And while Alex is